So this section on alcohol is at the end of chapter 3, depending on your edition. And so it's often, if it is at the end of chapter 3, then it is called the controversy section of chapter 3. So this set of slides deals with alcohol and drinking. And so a question to ask yourself is, how has alcohol and drinking affected your life? So we're going to go ahead and start on the content. So some alcohol statistics. If you take a look at some of these stats over here as to the proportion of these situations where there was a component involving alcohol, you can see that the intake of of alcohol in our country is really, and how it affects people, is pretty tragic. If you look at how many people in the United States consume enough alcohol to actually impact their caloric intake, you'll see that it's somewhere between 6 to 10% of their total daily caloric intake. So here is a link, a hyperlink to some statistics from the site called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And what I would suggest is to go ahead and go to their site. It's a great site and it has a lot of information about what underage drinking means, why is the drinking age 21, all kinds of things. So this is a great site. So this graph over here shows how, as the percent blood alcohol content goes up, you can see that the accident probability goes up. And so the reason why you have a legal limit in California of 0.08 is because at 0.08 blood alcohol percent is when you start to see a pretty strong increase of accidents. So here's a chart of those individuals that should not drink alcohol. So you can kind of see most of this is pretty straightforward. So go ahead and read some of these about some of these populations. I think some of the key things is the children, adolescents. The trend is that the earlier in life drinking begins, the greater the risk that the child or adolescent is going to continue drinking and potentially go on to the disease called alcoholism. Women who may become pregnant or who are pregnant or breastfeeding. This is extremely important to understand. A developing fetus or embryo is very immature in terms of development and structure. And so when a woman consumes alcohol, alcohol is a poison and is going to impact practically every single structure of that developing embryo or fetus. And so you can go ahead and read these other bullet points. This is some of the effects of alcohol intake on the brain. And if you notice that the brain volume has decreased quite a bit. So maternal alcohol intake, and the result is the single most preventable cause of mental retardation. As you can see, the brain is severely compromised of the developing child when the mother consumes alcohol. So here's a baby who was born addicted to alcohol. And then here's some characteristic signs of a child that's got what's called fetal alcohol syndrome. And fetal alcohol syndrome is at the extreme end of the spectrum. So now just like autism, there's a spectrum of effects of maternal alcohol intake. And so you have another type of effect of alcohol intake, and it's called fetal alcohol effect. So one thing that you might want to do is click on these hyperlinks in the formal presentation or the normal presentation of the PowerPoint, and it will take you to some sites that have lots of information about these two different points on the spectrum. So, what is alcohol? So, alcohol is a component of alcoholic beverages. And so, that alcohol is actually referred to scientifically as ethanol. So, most alcohols, when you talk about the chemistry definition of an alcohol, the OL indicates, based on the chemical structure of the molecule, that there is a certain chemical group on the molecule that classifies that molecule as an alcohol. So, the thing with alcohol is that it easily penetrates cells. So, as soon as a person consumes alcohol, all their body cells are affected. And alcohol will go straight through the lipid membrane or the fatty membrane of a person's cells. Nothing will stop it. So, continuing on, when you look at the lipid bilayer of cells, this fatty membrane is called a bilayer. Usually, most substances are stopped by this bilayer or lipid membrane, but alcohol or ethanol just nothing stops it. It's going to go straight through, just like as you see these molecules. It's going to go straight through from the outside of a cell to the inside of a cell. So alcohol is a toxin, and the body's going to treat alcohol or ethanol. I keep going back and forth. I tend to, when I'm talking about alcohol, I'm referring to ethanol. If I'm talking about a beverage, I will say alcoholic beverage. So, alcohol is treated as a toxin by the body, and it must be eliminated. That's how the body views alcohol. So, some other information is alcohol denatures or disrupts the structure of proteins in cell membranes. So, this picture right here is showing a lipid bilayer, which is the cell membrane. And within the cell membrane, you've got all these little blue structures. These blue structures are proteins. They make up several proteins that you will see on the surface of cells. So, ethanol, alcohol, will actually go through, as it's going through the cell membrane, it will actually disrupt the function and the structure of these proteins that often have very important jobs. They're sometimes receptors for hormones, channels needed to transport nutrients in and take wastes away. And so as alcohol goes through inside a cell, all structures are inside cells are going to be also killed by this toxin. So what this series of slide or picture shows is how alcohol is often the key agent in these antiseptics. And the reason is, of course, that alcohol disrupts the structure of cells. And so that's why these cleaners are going to work against bacteria. So, what is a drink? So, a drink actually has a defined meaning. So, one serving of alcohol is called a drink and delivers half an ounce of pure ethanol. So, half an ounce of pure ethanol is going to be one drink, and you can deliver that half an ounce in a bunch of different ways. So, down here you see 5-ounce glass of wine, beer, you see the hard liquors, the wine coolers. So all these are modes of delivering the half an ounce of the ethanol. So ethanol itself has 7 calories per gram. If you recall, fat's got 9 calories per gram. So alcohol or ethanol is pretty caloric. But remember, it's not the whole beverage that's 7 calories per gram. It's going to be the portion of a beverage that is ethanol that's got the 7 calories per gram. So the percentage of ethanol in these drinks are often called proof. So I'm going to tell you in the next slide where this word came from. So wine, when you look at wine down here, 12 to 13% of the weight of this wine is going to be ethanol. Beer is 4 to 6% of the weight of the beer, and then distilled, and that applies to wine coolers, and then distilled spirits. So like that, in distilled spirits, you concentrate the ethanol. So that's what distilled means. And so these distilled spirits are going to be up to 40% ethanol. So remember, any of these things are going to deliver half an ounce of pure ethanol. Don't get confused with the percentage of this of these drinks and the half an ounce of pure ethanol. So here's the history of the term proof, and so you can go ahead and read this, and it's kind of interesting how the term came about. Kind of gives you a sense how ethanol has just been a part of history, even like ancient history for millennia. So this is kind of showing you, even not that long ago, ethanol was pretty important even then, and now it's interesting our attitude towards ethanol. We find people who are drunk funny, and we also, there's many people who brag about getting drunk. But then if you look at the tragedy that's occurred because of alcohol intake, you'll see that it's kind of a interesting phenomenon. So any case, go ahead and read this little section on proof. A thing about proof, though, just going back, when people, so proof is basically 2 times, sorry, going back here. Oh, the best way to do it. So whenever you say proof, what you're saying is you are going to call, if you look at this case of distilled spirits, remember this is 40% ethanol, but you always multiply the percent of ethanol by 2, and that's going to be the proof. So that's how proof relates. Just whatever proof it is, divide it in half, and that's going to be the percent by weight of ethanol in a drink. So moving on here. So the hangover. So this is still not very well understood. It could be the toxic effects of certain compounds that contribute the unique tastes and aromas and colors of alcoholic beverages. The thing about that is those things could be the cause of the hangover. So there's a substance right here that's found in beer. And so people think that it's that substance that gives beer its special flavor is what causes the hangover. Another idea is that it's dehydration that's causing the hangover. And then another idea is that it's formaldehyde production and accumulation in the brain. So the thing about alcohol or hangovers is that only time will get rid of it. Coffee doesn't help. Nothing else will help. So when does alcohol become a problem? So you can kind of compare the two categories here. I would say that alcohol intake really becomes a problem when it starts, when consumption starts to push out other things. So if the intake of ethanol, the procurement of it, the recovery from large intakes of it starts to push work out, maybe relationships with family, with friends, when alcohol intake and everything associated with it starts to be such a huge proportion of a person's time, such that other things are pushed out, that's, I think, the defining characteristic of problem drinking. And so here's some long-term effects. So you can see it's pretty darn devastating to the fetus. This is just a tragedy. This alcohol intake, maternal alcohol intake, is just something that is not only affecting the person who's drinking, but also this innocent developing fetus. So you can kind of see what the huge damaging effects that ethanol intake can have. And then here's another set of long-term effects, and you can see I've highlighted malnutrition as a key one just because I want to talk a little bit later about how ethanol intake affects nutrition in particular. So here we go, some specific details on how alcohol affects nutrition. So obviously Alcohol will start to push out nutrient-dense foods and could potentially lead to malnutrition. Um, Alcohol intake starts to decrease the absorption of nutrients by the small intestine. So the small intestine becomes quite damaged. And so the absorption of other nutrients is going to be severely compromised. There is a syndrome called Wernicke-Korsakoff. And this is when a person, after years and years of heavy drinking, the damage to the brain is very unique. And one of the causes is a thiamine deficiency. So if you click on this link on the actual PowerPoint slides, you'll see a person who has Wernicke-Korsakoff. So you'll have some effects on the brain with this syndrome. So loss of short-term memory, very cognitively impaired, inability to solve problems. And then the second part of this syndrome is nerve damage. And you can see that the person that's highlighted in the clip is going to be severely compromised, even trying to walk. So liver damage, fat accumulation, fat stores, and then finally, well, not finally, but finally on the slide anyway, is the caloric contribution of ethanol intake. So remember, this slide is showing alcohol's effect on nutrition in particular, and that was related back to that list. So, so this is kind of hard to read, and basically it says, what is the definition of moderation? So we talk a lot about moderation, and so moderation in an average woman is no more than 1 drink per day, and for the average man, it's no more than 2 drinks per day. So when people say, are you a moderate or heavy drinker, then that's kind of the categorization of what's moderate. Now we're going to talk about tolerance, and this is really important. So tolerance is an actual biological phenomenon, and it's related to the amount of an enzyme that is responsible for breaking down alcohol in the stomach. Generally, the more of this enzyme you have, the easier it is, or the better you are at inactivating alcohol. When certain ethnic groups, and you'll see this will vary, the amount of this enzyme is going to vary based on gender, ethnic groups. There's plenty other variables. So again, when you have normal or high amounts of this enzyme, remember that's going to be dictated by DNA. You're not going to be able to control that. You are this particular enzyme. You are going to be able to detoxify ethanol and get rid of it. So you're not going to feel the effects of it as easily as someone who has low amounts of the enzyme. So you have this enzyme, you're going to see it in a minute, found in 2 places. You're going to find it in the stomach. And this little statement down here is related to the whole concept of tolerance. So you can kind of see what the definition is. And women have a lower tolerance than men, which means they have less of the enzyme. And then Asians and Native Americans, just examples of different ethnic groups, they also have lower tolerances than other ethnicities. So like Caucasians, Hispanics. So you're going to kind of see a difference based on ethnic background. So this is a really important slide. It's a little complicated, but I'm going to try to explain it as easily and as well as I can. So what you see, here's the name of that enzyme. It's called ADH. It's abbreviated ADH, or alcohol dehydrogenase. So what happens with it is it's the first enzyme that inactivates ethanol. So it's found in 2 places, so the stomach and the liver. So again, the more of this you have, the easier it is for you to break down the ethanol and not let it into your blood intact. The less of it you have in these 2 places, the more of the ethanol doesn't get broken down and enters the bloodstream and causes the effect. So here's ethanol. And then here's that enzyme. It's kind of hard to see. And then it gets broken down to this substance here, which ultimately gets broken down to this substance here. So you don't need to know all the details regarding the intermediates or any of these things called electron carriers. Just know that this first enzyme is needed to start the process of breakdown of ethanol. Now, what happens when a person starts to consume more and more ethanol, that's going to be tolerance. So a person starts to drink more and more ethanol and does not feel the effects. Basically, another system has to kick in to help ADH. So this system is called MEOS. And this system, MEOS, it's an abbreviation, helps the ADH to inactivate ethanol. And it's really going to start kicking in at higher and higher doses. So as a person transitions to higher and higher doses, then this enzyme system is going to start to help out the ADH. So tolerance is going to be built up with repeated MEOS activation. So here's kind of how it works. This arrow is kind of moved. So a person drinks 1 drink an hour on a full stomach. So most of that drink is going to go down to the small intestine. Now, the small intestine is then going to absorb it into the blood. And then what happens is there's a direct connection between the small intestine and the liver. So then the liver is going to collect the alcohol that it got from the small intestine through that portal vein, which is really critical because it's the connection between the small intestine and the liver. So the liver will then get that blood that contains the alcohol, and it's going to break it down with its own version of ADH. So what'll happen is as a person's intake goes up to 2 drinks per hour, the ADH in the liver then, remember, it's going to be overwhelmed. So the second enzyme system will start to kick in to help ADH. Then as a person transitions to drinking even more, then the ADH can't keep up and the MEOS also can't keep up for a little while. And so then the MEOS kind of realizes, I guess, that it has to become more active. So the MEOS will keep getting more active as the person's alcohol intake goes up. So tolerance is based on the second system having to kick in. And question always comes up, can you cause the second system to kind of decline? And yes, you can, so that the person's tolerance will go down, so they become less tolerant to ethanol. So this slide kind of shows you how the progression of ethanol intake takes. So we've got the person drinking ethanol. The ethanol is going to go down to the stomach. The stomach has a limited amount of ADH to help with the breakdown. And then the amount of ethanol, the majority of it, is not going to be affected by the ADH of the stomach. And so the majority of the alcohol is going to go to the small intestine. The small intestine is then it's very vascularized. There's tons of blood vessels around here. It's going to collect, the blood's going to collect the ethanol, and then it's going to transmit the ethanol through this vein called the portal vein. And the portal vein will go directly take the blood from the small intestine to the liver. So the liver has the 2 system. It's got the ADH system and the MEOS system. So remember, the stomach only has an ADH system. So now the liver can do the bulk of the breakdown of ethanol because it's got that backup. The thing is, when a person starts to drink more than 1 drink an hour, the liver then is going to struggle to break down the ethanol, even if it's recruited this ADH and the MEOS. That's when, remember, the MEOS is pretty flexible. It can start to become more active eventually as the person starts to, if the person continues to drink that amount of ethanol. So then whatever did not get broken down by these 2 systems is going to end up in the bloodstream, and then ultimately the brain is going to get the blood. And you can kind of see how different regions of the brain have different susceptibilities to the ethanol based on how much is consumed. So the first region of the brain that's going to be affected affected is the region that controls the judgment and reasoning. So then as more and more alcohol is consumed, then the next most sensitive region is going to be voluntary muscle control. And then finally, with increased, very high intakes of ethanol, you're going to affect the functions of the brainstem, and you're going to see respiration and heart action be disrupted. This is when a person can actually die at that high level of ethanol intake. So how does the stomach respond? So the stomach will break down 20% of the ethanol. And so just a repeat of what I said, all the ethanol, some of the ethanol can't be broken down, so it enters into the bloodstream from the stomach. So the stomach does have the ability to absorb ethanol. Remember, the ADH is in the walls of the stomach cells, so you are going to have some breakdown. So when a person drinks on an empty stomach, the ethanol that wasn't affected excuse me, by the stomach's ADH is going to go into the bloodstream. But if a person has eaten, there's no absorption of ethanol into the bloodstream, or very limited. So there we go. If an empty stomach, the ethanol goes into the blood quickly. And then if you look at the liver's response, the liver's going to stop doing everything. Liver does so many jobs, and everything's going to be put on hold until the ethanol is number one. Remember, the ethanol is going to be in blood that's coming from the small intestine, and so the liver is going to stop doing all its jobs until that ethanol is processed by its own ADH and also its Meiosis system. So then here's the comment. So if a person drinks slowly enough, approximately 1 drink an hour, the alcohol will be absorbed and delivered to the liver and processed without much effect to the rest of the body. So your liver essentially can break down about 1 drink an hour. As soon as that amount of drinks per hour starts to increase, then the liver's 2 enzyme systems are not going to be able to break down the ethanol, and then the ethanol is going to go into the bloodstream. It's going to be intact, and then it's going to go to the brain and affect the brain. So the liver will then keep up with breaking alcohol down, so a person may never actually feel intoxicated if they drink 1 drink an hour. So here's some information about how the number of drinks can actually affect the blood alcohol levels of different people of different weights. So a heavier person is going to have more blood, and so the same amount of drinks is going to result in a lower blood alcohol percent. So again, 1 drink per hour is how much the liver can handle. And if you go beyond that, then the ethanol is not going to be processed, and then it's going to go into the bloodstream and affect the brain. So how do breathalyzers work and urine tests work? Well, it tends to work in the sense that the breath and the urine excrete about 10% of the ingested ethanol. So if the person uses a breathalyzer or has a breathalyzer test done, whatever the reading is going to reflect how much is in the blood. So whatever the reading is here in the breath, you can kind of go back and say, well, if the thing read 10% of a certain number, it's easy to go back and say what the original number was. And so a urine test can also do that. So then here's the sequence. So you need to know the 3 regions that you see in this illustration. So the most sensitive, then the next most, and then we've got the last to be affected. So we've got this region here is called the frontal cortex, and then this rear region is called the rear cortex. Now, if you've had anatomy before, you may have more specific names for these different brain regions and more detailed names, and that's totally fine if on the test you want to use those. But for our purposes, we got the frontal cortex, we've got the rear cortex, and then we've got the very mid part of the brain, the upper brainstem, which we can call midbrain or upper brainstem. And so this is the last area to be affected. And you can kind of see how these different functions of the body are going to be affected by higher concentrations of ethanol. So the stages of liver damage, you can see what a healthy liver looks like, a fatty liver, that's the next stage. And then the more repeated abuse is going to result in what's called fibrosis, where you have scar tissue. And then years and years and years of abuse, you're going to result in cirrhosis, where the liver cannot be regenerated. If the person is at the stage of fibrosis, they can have a chance to revert back to healthy, but it's going to take a while to do that. So fatty liver is reversible, liver fibrosis is reversible, but cirrhosis is not. And so here are actual pictures. So the only thing that's not shown here is that fibrotic stage. So here's the normal, here's the fatty liver, fibrosis, actual fibrotic liver is not shown, and then here's cirrhotic liver. And then this is all the things that the liver does that's going to not happen with liver damage. So you can see how an alcoholic is going to have so many health problems, and many of them cannot be regained. So I just want to make sure you understand the difference between an alcoholic and a heavy drinker. So remember, the heavy drinker still can function with their daily activities. They go to work, they interact with their families, they don't get to a point where they're either spending a huge proportion of the time either buying alcohol, drinking alcohol, and recovering from alcohol. So they're somewhat functioning, whereas an alcoholic has an addiction. So alcohol addiction is kind of considered a disease now, and the person is going to need lots of help with getting over alcohol addiction, any addiction. There's a common pathway with all addictions. There's the reward center that many of the drugs that are used to help with alcoholism kind of target. And you may have heard of some of those. There's one called anti-abuse, and there's another one called naloxone. And those substances, those medicines can actually shut down the amount of reward a person gets from drinking alcohol. They also make the person quite sick. So alcoholism is very severe. It is a disease, and it's going to have to be so major therapy is going to need to happen to deal with alcoholism.